Today with me I have Christian Fernandez, a theater director and founder of the Jupiter Theater Company. Christian's plays are one-of-a-kind experience. They're engaging, extremely entertaining, and all-around good time. And I always come away from one of his productions hungering for another experience just like it. Welcome, Christian. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, James, and thank you very much for the kind words.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about your history with theater and when you decided it was your thing.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. People sometimes think that if you're in theater, you must have been doing it from day one. But aside from occasional, middle school productions or summer camps, I really didn't do anything theater related, at least through high school. Um, that said, in high school, I competed in forensics, speech and debate, and I mostly did debate, but I did speech, and part of forensic competitions, for those who are familiar with, for example, like STOA or NCFCA, is that they have these these speech categories called interpretations,
Okay.
and they are various genres. They've got dramatic, they've got original. When I first competed, they had something like open interpretation and humorous interpretation. So I did things like a dramatic interpretation of Julius Caesar, William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And these interpretations are only like 10 minutes long.
Okay.
You have to condense a story to 10 minutes, some sort of literature and such. So that was my quote-unquote theatrical experience throughout high school. And so I went to college and didn't get involved in the theater department over there, Eden Troupe, until sophomore year. That said, though, this is going to sound insanely nerdy, but it is what it is. I'm a great lover of opera. Always loved opera, studied it voraciously. And throughout high school, I constantly studied it, watched it. It very much has an impact even nowadays on my artistic and directing style. And so watching those operas just increased the love for the performative, for the artistic, for scale, and just at its heart, storytelling and the way that music and human emotion collaborate towards that storytelling. So in terms of actual formal theater experience, not that much actually before college. But once I got to college and I, mastered in literature and the like, that's where I really decided, all right, this is something I actually want to do.
What inspired you to found Jupiter Theater Company? Where were you in life?
That's a great question. So I was 1 year into graduate school. I have a Master of Letters in Shakespeare and Performance from Mary Baldwin University, which is down in Stanton, Virginia, and it collaborates with the American Shakespeare Center down there.
Gotcha.
And so I bring this up to say that I was in the midst of a incredible theater and literature department program there, because their program doesn't just teach you theater, nor does it just teach you literature. It's big on teaching you the union between the two.
Gotcha.
The famous phrase they have is from the page to the stage. So you study and appreciate the works as literature, and then you appreciate them all the more when you see their performative potential. So I was 1 year into that, and I had done a couple of plays in the program. I was learning a lot. Really kind of just transformed the program, that is, just transformed my understanding of directing and really the art of telling a story on the stage specifically. And I was only 2 hours away from people that I knew up here. All of the actors that I work with are people that I know in some capacity, or I've worked with before in some capacity. And quite frankly, we just all wanted to do a play together again. We just wanted to tell a story. And the story that I chose to tell, because of its themes that I just love of innocence versus experience, was Shakespeare's As You Like It. And so it honestly, JTC, that is, Jupiter Theater Company, just started as a group of people who wanted to tell a story. People who were interested in acting, such as, shout outs to Grace Richardson, Sutton Hay, Josh Ryan, and Jenna Pratt, for example. People who had some experience, wanted to take their acting to the next step, and myself, who wanted the experience again, putting into practice what I had been learning with directing, with what I had learned about Shakespeare, and again, just tell a good story, that people of all ages and experiences, whether they like theater or not like theater, something that was approachable to all those audiences.
Yeah.
And I remember praying to the Lord. I said, Lord, because we started with nothing. I mean nothing. There was there was a lot of negotiations, a lot of agreements, to be mutually beneficial to us and other parties, and it all worked great. Couldn't have gone smoother, actually. But I remember telling the Lord, Lord, if you want this to be something that continues, not just for us, but for the community, let this first show go well and let us have the resources to do other shows. And we got those resources, and then we started more plays, and those plays did well again, and so we've been just gradually increasing our resources. But to kind of wrap this long answer up, the vision that I always had for JTC, honestly, is one that goes back to my high school self.
Okay.
Who was reading about theater and watching theater and opera, and at least back in Miami, Florida, there was really no access to classical theater that was either approachable, particularly for Christians. Not that everything needs to be washed up, but there's a line, and we talk about all the time in JTC. How do you teach the text, but at the same time still remain appropriate for audiences, right? That you're welcoming to audiences. And the other key thing to balance was affordability. And so I wanted, when I thought of JTC and created JTC, I wanted it to be a company that could still perform top-notch theater to audiences of all different backgrounds, different experiences, that at the same time was affordable, so that they could still view it as, a delightful evening of entertainment.
Well, I've always been entertained, so
well, that's good. That's good.
Good job.
That's good.
So with JTC, you like to try and recreate the Elizabethan era, Shakespeare era plays.
At least with these Shakespeare plays,
at least with that. And then you've done a couple others. They're very similar.
Very similar.
Style.
Yeah, very similar.
But what about that particular style of theater gets you excited to share it with an audience?
Yeah, I absolutely adore the inviting, receptive aspect of it, wherein an audience doesn't feel like they're just watching the play; they're part of the play. And then the next part of it that really excites me is not just as the director, but I've acted in several of our plays, and when you actually don't have to be aware of the audience, you can enjoy being with the audience, you can participate with them, you can react with them, you can interact with them. The story becomes this collaborative process. You're almost having a sort of communion with the audience in the storytelling, and so that's me from the directing acting perspective. And as I think any good performer needs to do, you need to think about, well, what's the audience going to experience? If I was in the seats, what would I be experiencing? And you got to constantly be thinking about, at what point might I get bored by something? At what point would I just laugh my head off because something's so great and immersive and interactive? And it gives you, thinking that way, right? Gives you, as the performer, as the director, so many tools to produce really good theater that's, not just entertaining, but really high quality. So that's what I love about it. It's not just, oh, cool, we get to interact with the audience. It's just an invaluable resource, I would say.
Awesome. So what are some aspects about, I mean, I guess we touched on this a little bit, but what are some aspects about this kind of theater that you personally think is better than most of today's stuff?
Yeah, great question. Let me begin by saying that, like I kind of intimated a little bit ago, this style is not for every single play. Like personally, there are quite a number of serious, tragic stories that the proscenium setup, I think, is even better. For example, and especially plays that are spectacle oriented, like heavily spectacle oriented, you kind of need that separation, so to speak, between the audience and the stage. almost like a Disney ride, right? You know, you're immersed, but at the same time, there's this separation to some extent. Now, that said, though, I think this style works particularly better for comedy, because it allows the actor to kind of indicate to the audience the meaning of the jokes, of the lines, right?
Okay,
Something we're big on at Jupiter Theater Company is teaching the text, right? You know, if an actor doesn't understand the lines, the audience isn't going to understand the lines. And even if the actor understands the lines and the audience doesn't understand the lines, they're not going to get the humor of it. So I think this style is effective across the board, but I think particularly effective for comedy because it brings the audience into sort of the role of another person at the table, and everyone's laughing and joking around together, you know, and they feel like the jokes are aimed towards them. They're not just this passive recipient of the joke. You know what I mean? So if we were in a proscenium setting and you and I are the two characters and we make a joke or a comment back or an insult even back and forth, it's primarily between the two of us, and the audience is just observers of that, and you know the hope is that they're entertained by it. But if you're able to, you know, for example, in Love's Labor's Lost, we were just talking rehearsal yesterday, this idea of two characters basically just dissing another character, right? But instead of it being those two characters just talking back and forth to each other and talking about this third character on the stage, the way we blocked it was we had these two characters talking to several audience members such that it wasn't just two people dissing this other character. We invited the audience to be part of that dissing. And so the jokes, I think, are a lot clearer. I think the text makes a lot more sense, particularly with more complicated scripts like Shakespeare and early modern scripts in general. Makes it clear to the audience such that they're able to feel like they're, again, in it, not just watching it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So you've talked a bit about your rehearsal processes and like interview nights. Walk us through the typical rehearsal process for one of these kinds of productions, because it seems much more loose.
Yeah, and that's intentional. One of the biggest things that I learned in graduate school, a shout out to two professors in particular, Dr. Matthew Davis and Professor Doreen Bechtel, who were much more in the performative aspect of the department. They really highlighted and showed me how, you know, when we say artistic liberty or an actor's freedom, that can seem like a really broad thing, right? You still need the director to come in and have that big picture framing mentality, right? The director's there to frame. But it's loose, our rehearsals, that is, are loose in the sense that we want our actors to be able to think about what would their characters be doing? What are their characters inclined towards doing? We want to see, you know, our actors follow their impulses in the moment so that we can see the human of the characters. You see how they react to each other. Reacting is a big thing in our company. We really want to see not just how someone says something, but how another person reacts to it. And that goes, again, towards helping the audience understand what's going on and what the dynamics between characters are. So we're loose in the sense that what we'll do is, or free rather, we'll start the rehearsal process where we'll kind of get our bearings, where we'll run the scene the first time without any interruption. And I should add that before we even do that, we'll collectively set a goal for the rehearsal. So we do the scene, one full run, no interruption. Let the actors get their bearings, right? Let's see what they naturally just add to the scene or throw into the scene. Then as the director, what I try to do is I give one, maybe two general notes. General notes that apply to everyone. For example, avoid this part of the stage, or avoid congesting in this part of the stage, for example. Something that applies to everyone, right? And so what you're not doing is telling the actor, you know, you're not holding the hand of the actor and saying, do this, do this, do this, right? You're telling the actor, like, here are sort of the boundaries, the framing, again, to operate with it. But you can operate within there as you please, right? And the frame is only because if we break that frame, that boundary, so to speak, it's just from a big picture's perspective, we're not telling the story as well as we could. That's the only thing for that. So I start with that. We run the scene. I'd start with 1, 2 general notes, and then I give each actor one note, one
Gotcha.
specific note to work on for the next run of the scene.
Gotcha.
And I'm very specific about keeping it to one note, specific note, at maximum two if there's something that absolutely needs to kind of be fixed in the moment.
Gotcha.
Because, it's not that actors have bad memories.
Yeah.
But you're acting, you've got lines to memorize, you've got certain
Yeah.
dynamics to remember, certain blocking that you're really, you've determined maybe in a previous rehearsal is really good that you're trying to remember. And I found that actors, when they have that one specific thing to work on for the next run of the scene, not only do they remember it for that point, for that run, they remember it for the following subsequent runs. So we do the scene again. The second time, I will interrupt for very specific things.
Gotcha.
And then we repeat the process. We run the scene. I'll interrupt a few times for something very specific, such as, hey, remember that general note? We're losing our grip on it, though. Let's come back to that note, right?
Gotcha.
And then it gets fixed in the moment. Then we get to the end of the scene, and I'll say, whether or not the notes from the previous run were fulfilled or not, and whether some things look good or not. And then I'll do the same thing. General note again, one specific note per actor, and then we do it again. I try to run the scenes at least 3 times within a 45-minute span.
Gotcha.
And then at the end of the rehearsal, because no scene's ever perfect, what we'll do is debrief and basically say, okay, great, did we meet the objective? Hopefully yes. But then I'll say, when we return to the scene next time, we'll want to think about taking a look at this next aspect to the scene.
Gotcha.
So always beginning the rehearsal with an objective, ending the rehearsal with answering, did we meet that objective? And then planting the initial idea of what the next objective is going to be at the next rehearsal. So that's usually, I would say, as a whole, what my rehearsal process is.
Gotcha. So speaking of rehearsals, what is the number one thing that you find yourself having to constantly remind your actors to do?
You know what? It has to be energy. It has to be energy. And let me preface this by saying that when you're on stage, I even find myself doing this. We have moments where we want to be a TV actor or a movie actor. We're thinking of the close-up, the dramatic pan-in, right? This still moment where everything's focused on us, right? And when you're a theater actor, in some ways that temptation is even stronger. I'm not saying I've never done movie acting or anything. But think about it, you've got a whole auditorium of people waiting for you to speak.
Yeah.
And even your fellow actors, like, they've got a script and they've got scripts. They know it's your turn to speak. So it's really tempting for actors to have that moment of everything slowing down for me so I can kind of slow down as well. And there are definitely moments for that. But one of the big things I stress to all of our actors is earn your pauses. Earn your pauses. Have a lot of high energy. Avoid any sort of empty spaces, empty moments. Professor Doreen Bechtel used to say that if there's a moment of stillness that's not earned, theater is, quote, dead. And it seems like an extreme thing to say, but really, when you're an audience member, your attention span, not to insult anyone, I feel the same way, your attention span's really not that great. It doesn't last that long, so you constantly need things to be going on. And it's not to say that theater needs to be frantic or hyper. But it is to say that there are things that naturally need to fill in the space. Reactions, for example. Audible reactions. If someone's talking and then there's a pause, an audible reaction does a lot towards making the audience keep pace with the energy of the scene. And so, especially, for example, I keep coming back to Love Labor's Lost just because we're about to put that on in a couple weeks now. And, as you know, without spoiling anything, the last few scenes of the play are very dramatic. But not high energy dramatic. They're very much kind of like all of the energy and air in a room just gets sucked out by something suddenly shocking happening. So that's not just earning a moment of pause, that's almost earning a whole couple of scenes of pause. Well, what do you do to build up to that? Well, and this is not just to sound like an arbitrary orchestrator of the play. Naturally, when you look at how I think I think it's the way Shakespeare constructed it. The way he constructs the whole play leading up to that moment is it is dynamic, high energy. Everyone's got different energy. Everyone's got different dynamics. They're different characters. Everyone's not the same, but there is high energy, constant excitement, constant interaction, debate, clash, conflict, reveals, right? So that when you get to this huge pinnacle moment in the play where the energy gets sucked out, the audience feels that, but it's immersive, not suddenly boring. So that I would say is sort of the big thing I constantly remind my actors. If the scene, especially if it's this sort of crescendo moment, keep the energy up. Keep the energy, especially on entrances and exits. Keep the energy up because, I'll end with this. If you leave a scene with low energy, even if it's a serious moment, if you end a scene with low energy, you have now just sort of shifted the burden to the next actor who's entering the scene to have to bring the energy up. And if that transfer doesn't work well, it makes for a very awkward transition, I would say. So that's what I would say is kind of the regular note I have.
So, what is your writing process like? Because I know you have to whittle stuff down to some extent. How do you decide that?
You mean kind of like my cutting process for when I cut the scripts?
When you sit down and look at the whole thing.
Yeah. No, great question. I think the first thing I look for is themes, particularly with these more classical plays. Shakespeare, these writers, they're just brilliant. They're incredible. And it's such a shame that some of their brilliance can't even be depicted on the stage. Which seems odd because they're performative texts. But I think that goes to the genius of the works. They can be appreciated both as literature and as performative text. So I would say that I start with the themes. What are the big things that come out, right? But I balance that with what can actually be shown on stage. For example, I worked with another person, shout out to Jane White, who's actor-manager on Love's Labor's Lost and is directing Much Ado About Nothing with me. And we worked on the cuts, the script cuts for both plays. And we had discussions about how there are some really neat lines, right? But you got to bring the play down to a certain length. And even though a line or several lines might go towards that theme, if it's not able to come across in performance, one has to wonder what value it gives to the show. And that sounds horribly utilitarian, but rest assured it is a last step. It is a last step when determining what to cut, right? So anyway, that's what I start with, themes. The next thing I look at is parallels. I'm big on parallelism.
Gotcha.
One of my favorite literary techniques is something that's been called Chekhov's gun. The idea that if you bring something in, it's got to be fulfilled later on, right? Chekhov gave the example specifically. If a writer describes a gun on the wall, right, something has to happen to the gun. I think he specifically said that the gun has to be fired by the end of the play or the story, right? So that what you're doing is you're not just introducing things or bringing things in for a moment of information or momentary entertainment. You then set something up there that then gets brought up later on, right? And so a key example is in Act 4, Scene 2, Holofernes and Sir Nathaniel have a moment where, Sir Nathaniel is going to read aloud a sonnet, right? And we were just talking about this yesterday in rehearsal, having a moment where Holofernes shushes the audience. Because then later on in the play, when Holofernes is performing in a little play, a play within a play, Holofernes then shushes the audience again, right? So you see this sort of strict, the show is going on sort of characteristic that is introduced and then brought up later or even fulfilled later on. And you can get ideas for that parallelism or even see the parallelism already there in the text. So that's the second thing I would say I look at. The third thing is obscure, antiquated references. Now, we at JTC are big, though, on still teaching the text, like I said, and it's still informative. It's an educative experience. So we still keep in classical references, and we all hold ourselves to the standard that if something doesn't really make sense, actors got to make it make sense, right? But there are some references that audiences just do not get, right? You would have to basically have footnote a footnote
yeah.
for everything, and you don't. That's not what theater's supposed to be
Mhm.
about. And I'm a big literature person, but at the end of the day, it's still performance. So if it gets
Yeah.
towards footnote performance, so to speak,
Yeah.
you're kind of losing the point.
Gotcha.
I think so. If something is just too obscure, right, and it does, and I should add that it's too obscure and it does nothing, right, for the
Gotcha.
scene, right.
Yeah.
It's just a specific line that, not to say that lines are useless, but doesn't really add as much as other lines do.
Mhm.
That's, I would say, is probably the last criterion I go by when determining a cut. So, and then probably as a fourth thing, I always try to make the first the first part of the play before intermission longer than the second half.
Gotcha.
So I always aim for about an hour 15, hour and a half first, then intermission, and then about an hour after intermission.
Gotcha. What are some ways you're hoping to expand JTC in the future, or are you satisfied at where you're at currently?
Yeah, good question. Not satisfied, and it's not because of anything bad with the company. It's I'm a go-getter.
Exactly.
And I think we've got something, not to brag about the company, but I think we've got something really neat here that's in the works. In terms of where I see the company going, though, definitely expanding its education department, which we're already in the works on doing. We've very much done a blend of like small plays and big plays, and I very much want to keep that. Something I would like to see the company do is now start doing some proscenium plays. We've done everything thrust or alley style, and again, I still want us to use the audience interaction. But I also want us to branch out and see how we do proscenium and all the. It's not a loss; it's a gain in some ways. You lose some things for sure, but like I said, the spectacle, the opportunities you can have with the proscenium, I really want to see us explore with that. And then genres, we've been mostly just doing comedies. In fact, everything we've done up to this point is a comedy, which has been deliberate. But I'm very excited to see us branch out into tragedies. Branch out into non-Shakespeare plays, and then just as a fun little teaser for some things that we're really wanting to work on, we're already working on, is historical and biblical epics.
Gotcha.
So we're in the works on doing one story. I won't share too much about it, but it's there's one story that's based during World War I that's in the works. At some point in the future, I know we have ideas to do a mounting of the Exodus story.
Gotcha.
And there's a trilogy I've got in the back of my mind. I won't reveal just yet what that trilogy is, but it's a great biblical story that I think would make a powerful set of plays.
Awesome.
So very much, I think the goal for the company is to be part of the community, as dominant storytellers in the community that people can view. College students can be like, hey, JTC's doing a show, let's go. And then kids, the big thing for me is kids. Like, I'm big on innocence, and there's something, everyone needs to go back to their childhood to some extent, right? You think back to that excitement you had as a kid whenever you went to see a show or you went on a Disney ride. Creating that for not just adults but also children, while still telling profound stories, I think that's something that's really fulfilling and exciting. And so that's something that I'd really like to see JTC do with all of its different plays and different genres.
That's awesome. I'm definitely looking forward to all that. All right, a couple more questions.
Sure.
What are your biggest inspirations in terms of directors, actors, performances, all across the board?
Yeah, so, let me count the ways. Well, let me start with just another nerdy confession. One of the first exposures I had to directing was watching old videos of classical music conductors in rehearsals. And that is something I still do. I very much still do. So my first real interaction with directing or experience watching directors was watching, his name's Herbert von Karajan. Great classical music conductor. I think as early as the 50s. I think so. Yeah, 40s even. I'm sorry, what am I saying? 40s, because he left Nazi Germany. And so one of my favorite videos to watch is his orchestra. I think it's the Berlin Philharmonic. They're rehearsing Schumann's Fourth Symphony, and he teaches as he conducts. It's beautiful. And you realize, they have a score in front of them, just as actors have a text in front of them.
Yeah.
But the director very much still has interpretations, and the musicians contribute to that. And he goes along and he'll interrupt, right? But he's teaching as he's going along. And he's explaining this big picture understanding. He's not just nitpicking what the oboe's doing or what the drum's doing just because of an auditory sensitivity, right? Sure. Although that's part of it too. It's because he's got a big picture understanding of how this sets up this, which flows into this, and then is resolved at the end. And you see that as well with Leonard Bernstein. Though I would probably give Karajan especially the props for that. So that was my first experience to watching a director, right? Yeah. And then while I'm talking about Karajan's Salzburg Festival production of Don Giovanni, in terms of scale, I became a big lover. Still am a huge lover of scale. Mm-hmm. Not to dwarf performances, just what it can do. Also, it's a celebration of human art, right? Yeah. Landscapes that in the backdrops someone can create, the architecture you can put on stage. It's really just incredible. You get the spectacle of cinema, but the personability, the immersiveness of live theater. Yeah. So those were my first experiences. There are a couple. I saw multiple operatic productions. His name's Sam Levin, John Levin. Some Metropolitan Opera productions that were big. At least, so that was my first experience with watching like directors and their concept for things being staged. And again, Karajan also did several operas that I loved watching. And then film has been big for me. I've always been an avid film lover. At the risk of sounding generic, Christopher Nolan is a big fan of Chris. I would have to say he is my number one director. Just absolutely love him. He's big on parallelism. He's very big on parallelism. Martin Scorsese's another really good one. And so something I've been especially doing a lot now is there's a show called The Dick Cavett Show, back from the 70s and 80s. And he interviews all sorts of people, and some of the people he talks to are movie directors. And they just talk about all their different techniques and what they're looking for. And then finally, Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg. George Lucas is great for story, for story building, but in terms of technique and all, Steven Spielberg's also just phenomenal at listening to his techniques and the like. So, as it pertains to theater, opera is a form of theater, live theater in and of itself. I had the good fortune of being the assistant to the director for a director named Jenny Bennett. Shout out to her if she happens to ever hear this one day. She's directed multiple things, done a lot of off-Broadway things as well. And so she was, actually, to kind of bring some things full circle, I was doing this directing internship under her the summer that I was working on As You Like It. And came up with the idea to do our first show. Awesome. So I was kind of, I learned already from a directing class. I was going to take another directing class because I really wanted to learn even more. And I did the internship to learn in practice. And Jenny was really just phenomenal at having a vision for how she wanted things to look. She was constantly meeting with the props director, the stage manager, but very professional and let the actors do their thing. Gotcha. And at the same time, knew when to kind of not put her foot down, because that sometimes seems draconian almost. Yeah. But she knew when to ask a director, I need this next level from you. I know this part is really difficult. I need you to give a little bit more. Gotcha. And so she was very tactful in how she did that. And so that was, I think, one of the best experiences I had in terms of being right there to watch a director in practice. Another thing I noticed and you see this with film directors too, they don't talk a lot. They don't talk a lot on the set, at least some of the really good ones. They'll take a moment to explain a lot of things, right? But they know when to give the actor an idea of what needs to change, and then they trust the actor to take it from there. And not, all these directors I mentioned to you, several of them don't do that all the time. There are moments where every director, including myself, just gets carried away with explaining something. But I would say all those directors and that experience, as early as high school, watching those classical music rehearsals, very, very profound impact on my
Awesome.
style.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time.
Are we already?
So one last question
Sure.
to wrap us up. What would be your encouragement to young and aspiring actors and directors?
I would say always keep your enthusiasm for just storytelling. It's not to say that because there are some people who will just give advice where it's like believe in yourself, and
Yeah.
not to shoot down that, but it's generic, it's too broad,
Yeah.
and it doesn't give someone something specific to hold on to.
Mm.
You still, as a director, as a performer, have the technical details to get down. There's
Yeah.
always logistical things that need to be figured out, especially as a director, right? And you need to have a business acumen to some extent to know how to handle different dynamics, different
Yeah,
relationships, different logistics. So all that goes into that. But it's important to always remember, what story are you telling and why are you telling the story, right? Not for any necessarily agenda reasons, although there are some stories told for that, and there are some stories that told for that for good, that are done quite well. But whether it's a political documentary or it's one of my favorite movies of all time, the 1939 Errol Flynn Robin Hood, which is just this very precious, innocent, just storybook sort of telling of the Robin Hood story.
Yeah.
No matter how innocent it may be, just remember why you're telling a story, because the thing that always motivates me is thinking of my audience as sort of the child, like myself, who would crawl into bed, open a good book, and could just live in the world of the story.
Yeah.
And that's what I do hope to do with my plays, and something that I would tell any young director or performer to always remember and hold on to, no matter what they're going through or what difficulties they may face or trials they may come across.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for joining me today.
No, thank
It's
you,
been
James.
Awesome.
Real honor.